Am I running yet? All righty. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to look starting in about verse 5. And in looking at this, let's be mindful that we've already seen that work is honorable, that working hard is expected of the Christian. And we're going to start developing that a little bit more and looking at some various circumstances that can sometimes affect our attitude toward these things. Verse 5, bondservants, and I think I've mentioned this before, the word that's very often in the New Testament translated bondservants is a word that's a very broad word, can fall anywhere on that spectrum. Sometimes, I think the King James used the word slave a lot. More of the modern translations intentionally don't use the word slave because it carries with it the mindset of forced servitude, and that's not always what this word means. It can mean that, but it also can mean an indentured servitude, in other words, one that I go into by covenant agreement, or it can be even the concept of what we call employment. And so it's just any time that I engage myself to someone to work for them, or am engaged by someone to work for them, if the case may be that. Bond servants, obey your earthly masters. And masters there, again, needs to be understood simply in terms of those who have authority over you. In every work relationship, someone has authority over you. Someone hires you, even if you're just a hired employee, and you owe them your time and your skills. That's the agreement. They're going to give you so much for your time and your skills, and for that time period, you owe them that time. Obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. What does that mean, with fear and trembling? Okay, there's a couple of people whispering out there. I'm sorry? Concern? Okay. Anything else? Okay, respect is a good term to use. So it's not just listen to them, but listen to them with reverence. Fear and trembling is the kind of language that's used to describe how we should approach who? God. And so it's reverential respect. Keeping in mind, as we've already pointed out in previous studies, do your work heartily as unto the Lord rather than men. So the whole relationship, don't think of it as this is my boss. Think of it as my relationship to this authority demonstrates my respect for God's authority. Just like the Bible argues that that's why we show respect to the governing authorities. Not because they are better than us, or they're more valuable than us, or they have greater qualities than us, or they're smarter than we are, or whatever else it may be. Listen, I've worked for some people at times in my life that I didn't find to be brilliant. They didn't always ask me to do things the way that I thought would be the most efficient way to do them, or even the best way to do them. So is it my job to argue with them about how I'm going to do what they've asked me to do, or do I just do it the way that they've asked me to do it? Fact of the matter is, if I approach them with fear and trembling, then I just do what they have asked me to do. Now, if they create an environment where they allow me to give input and make suggestions, I can do that. Or if they create an environment where I am free to choose how I'm going to do something, I have freedom to exercise my will. That's still respecting them, right? That's the situation that they've created. I just don't get to set up the situation. I need to respect the situation and do it. So listen to what he says. Bondservants, obey your masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart. Listen, We're getting into levels that make this really, really hard. Has anybody ever worked for someone that you thought was just, there's not a nice way to say it, dim? You just didn't think they were very smart? And you could see much more effective ways to do a task that would make everybody better off. The client would be better served. The business would be better served. The business would make more money if they would just do it a different way. That's just crazy. It wastes time. It wastes money. It wastes resources. How hard is it to be sincere in heart, approaching that job with respect, approaching that master with fear and trembling? Listen, I've witnessed subordinates being insubordinate to their bosses. I've witnessed it firsthand. I've done it a few times myself. And so not only am I to go into this with an attitude saying, wait a minute, okay, I am not in control here, and I need to respect this person who is, but he says, I want you to even be sincere in that. Don't just do it even though you don't believe that it's the right way to do it. Be sincere. You ever heard anybody say yes, sir, or no, sir, but it was clear that they didn't mean it? They said it with contempt? That's a lack of sincerity. Saying sir or ma'am is a show of what? Respect. If I do it with a lack of sincerity, what is that actually saying? I'm pretending to respect you, but you know I don't really. That's the opposite of doing this with sincerity of heart. Has He put a really high standard on this for us? An extremely high standard. Going in with sincerity of heart is an extremely high standard. But notice how He says it. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. In other words, don't see a person there. See Christ. Recognize the authority of the situation, not the individual, not the personality of the situation. You remember the Roman soldier that came to Jesus? Had I believe it was a servant girl at home that was sick and dying. And Jesus said, hey, I'll go and help you. Remember what His response to her was? First off, He said, no, you don't need to come to my home. He understood and knew that that was what? What kind of problem would that create for Jesus to go into this Roman centurion's home? It'd make him unclean. And so He had enough respect for Jesus to say, no, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm not asking you to do anything that would offend your conscience or that would make you unclean before your God. And then He said something extremely profound. He said, listen, I am a man who is both under authority and a man who is in authority. I have people who are under my charge, and I tell them to go and they go, and I tell them to stay and they stay. They do what I tell them to do. I'm also under people's charge, and when my superiors tell me what to do, then I follow their commands. He said, I understand this authority thing, and so I know that all you have to do is say the word. If you'll simply say the word, my servant will be healed. And what was Jesus' response to that? I've not seen such great faith in all of Israel. Grasping authority and understanding that authority is something that is independent of personality is extremely important. Your father doesn't deserve respect because of how smart he is, or because of how old he is, or because of how wise he is, or because of how skilled he is, or because of how strong he is. Your father deserves respect because God said fathers should be respected. Your mother doesn't deserve respect because of how strong and powerful she is. And what happens in a lot of homes is kids are afraid of dad because dad hits harder. Got to rephrase that. Dad spanks harder. I don't want anybody to misunderstand. But mom, she's weak. I'm taller than her. I'm bigger than her. She can't really do anything to me. That's not why I respect mom. Because she poses some physical threat to me. Why do I respect my mother? Because God said, children, obey your parents. And He said, love your parents and give return to your parents. And so I respect them because of the authority that God has placed in that position, not because of the individual. Now, it's great when you can respect the individual. That's wonderful. But it's a different thing, even in that relationship. And it's true in every relationship. And that's why He says here, behave as if you are doing this for Christ. If it was the resurrected Jesus asking you to do something, how would you approach Him in His request? And He says that's how you should respond to your earthly masters. Listen to what He goes on, not by way of eye service. Again, putting a very high standard here. You've got to have a sincere heart, and you're not just trying to please them. You're not just trying to look good. You're not just trying to do the right thing because you want to impress people as people pleasers. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Now, what this means is that everything that he said up to this point, this idea of having fear and trembling and obeying your masters, all of that is the will of God. That's what that last verse we just read requires. Rendering service with a good will as unto the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he's a bondservant or is free. In other words, don't do it simply for a paycheck. Don't do it simply because you think your boss is fair. Don't do it simply because you get rewards or accolades. Don't do it so that you're named Teacher of the Year. Do it so God will reward you for being a good servant of God. Which means that the only thing I really need in order to merit my putting my best effort into respecting these relationships is a knowledge that God is going to eventually reward me. That I'm going to be pleasing Him and that He's going to save me. And that means that doing this is part of the process of attaining the salvation of my soul. What if I don't? What if I don't respect that authority? What if I don't do a good job? What if I am simply doing it as a means to be people pleasers? Or to gain some earthly reward from it? What if that's the way I go through my entire life serving? Do you think God's going to be pleased with me? So I have to think about these things, and you think about it like before you go. You don't get yourself in the situation and then say, oh, okay, never mind, I have to do this. You think about it ahead of time and you go into it with that attitude. I'm going to suggest to you that there's actually a side benefit to that. If you go into a job with that kind of an attitude, unless you've got a completely tone-deaf individual that's your boss, and there are those guys out there that are just so self-absorbed, they don't appreciate anything from anybody. But unless you've got that kind of a boss, you're going to make a really good employee, and you're going to get some of those other things. They're going to let you know that they appreciate you. They're going to pay you well. They're going to take care of you. They're going to recognize the hard work that you do. But that's not what we ought to be looking for. We ought to be doing all this as we would Christ. Yes, ma'am.
Back in the 1990s, I was CFO in a love center, and my boss, I noticed that there was some activity going on that was not accounted for, and I discovered that he was selling things that were not documented out of the wells with one of our truck drivers. And what we did was, rather than ruin him and his family, we took him off being signatory of our account, and we created an environmental division, and we made him the head of that. And because we recognized he did more good than bad, and after that incident, he actually rose up and became a really good boss under that division.
Right. So there are even ways to help people reform and grow and learn. If you respond to them in a good way rather than in a vengeful way. We are going to talk, in fact, go ahead and flip over to 1 Peter, the book of 1 Peter. And as you're turning over there, I'll say this. Christians, really all people, because these things should apply to all people. Obviously, unbelievers are not going to be swayed or persuaded or driven to please the Lord, so they're not necessarily going to follow it. But with that caveat in there, Christians should literally make the best employees in the world. Now, there's some exceptions to that. There are some times that it runs counter to what someone wants to do, and it just like people got mad at Jesus and wanted to kill him, there'll be bosses that hopefully won't kill you, but they might fire you, especially if they're wanting to do things in an unseemly way that you can't do. And you say, no, I can't do that. And sometimes because of moral restrictions that you place upon yourself to please God, you've got a boss or somebody that wants to engage in extramarital relations with you, and you say, no, I can't do that. Sometimes that'll make them mad, and you'll have to deal with reprisals from that. Or you don't engage in some of the social functions that they engage in, and they're bothered by that. But as a general rule, when it comes to the workplace and the job that you do and the kind of employee you make, if that's what's important to the business and that's what's important to the boss, we ought to make the best employees around. We ought to be so good that people who are making the hiring decisions are going, look, I need more people like that. If you can bring me someone like you, I would love it. Because if we could have a whole staff of people that work like you, things would be perfect. Authority is respected. Work is being done. It's being done diligently. It's being done to the very best of your ability. You're respecting those who have authority over you. You're respecting all of these relations. You're moral. You're honest. You're fair. You're good. All of those things can be. It ought to be the case that we make the best employees in the world. But what if we have a bad boss? And not just what if we have a bad boss. What if we have just a mean, spiteful, hateful boss that's disrespectful to us, that abuses us, talks down to us, misuses us? How are we supposed to be in that situation? This is where 1 Peter chapter 2 Let's look at verses 18 and 19. Now, this is a whole section starting back in verse 13. Well, in fact, let's back up to verse 13 and at least read that verse so you can get the context that these verses fall in. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Okay, what does that mean? Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. All right, take the qualifier out of the middle. And the statement is, be subject to every human institution. Which means what? Respect earthly authority. That's what it means. Whether we're talking about governments, whether we're talking about workplaces, whether we're talking, doesn't matter. Every situation, every relationship, he says, respect the institution. Now, the qualifier tells us why. Because the institution is perfect? No. For the Lord's sake. That's the why. As a means of demonstrating that I respect God. And so he goes down through and he talks about the emperors and he talks about governors and he talks about all these different levels. And look at verses 18 and 19. He starts getting more and more personal, more and more close to the individual. And he says, servants. That's our word again. That same broad kind of term that can go from slaves to employees. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. So what if I've got a boss that I don't think deserves my best? What does God say about that? Give them your best anyway for my sake. Think about how gracious it is. That you are showing this respect and you're doing this and you're doing the very best work that you can for someone. The people around, if the boss doesn't, and let's say we've got a completely tone-deaf individual that is so self-absorbed, he doesn't even appreciate what you're doing, or she doesn't appreciate what you're doing. There are people around who are seeing this. And you remember how Peter talks about always being ready to answer for the hope that's in you? Listen, here's the real life scenario. I am a hardworking employee that does the very best work that I can do, despite the fact that I am being dumped on every day by my boss. And someone walks up to me and says, why do you put up with that? And why do you work so hard for someone who treats you so poorly? And you get to say, for the Lord's sake. I do it because I'm a Christian. And God has instructed us to respect this authority even when the person wielding it is unjust. It does not make you weak. It makes you very strong. Jesus was the bravest, most powerful human that has ever walked the earth. Because though he had the power to call 12 legions of angels from heaven down to destroy the earth, he submitted to the cross. That takes a whole lot more character and quality than to fight and to be evil. Don't do it because they deserve it. Do it because God deserves it.
You know, I think it's important to, and sometimes you get in that middle spot where you're somebody else's boss,
Right.
You're in a small office, you're over people, and your boss is over you and them, and then you have a boss that treats employees unfairly, and you have to, when you're in the middle, you kind of have to be in the middle a little bit, and if your boss is out of line, you know, and I think you should speak up for your employees, right? That you're
Okay.
over.
That's a good question. And I'm glad you brought it up because that lets me
But not
explore.
Be ugly,
Right.
Be respectful.
Right. Let's us explore a little bit. So for the benefit of those that are watching online, the question was raised. What about we'll use this terminology, your middle management. You got people over you and you've got people under you. And your boss is being abusive and you've got people in your charge. Do you defend them? And my simple answer to that is absolutely. Now, nothing's ever simple though, because there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And I want to delve into this too deeply because it just so happens that it's part of what we're talking about in the sermon this morning. But I'll try to do this in a way that lays some groundwork and foundation for what we continue to explore this morning in the sermon in a much broader setting. There's a respectful way to do it, and there's a disrespectful way to do it. I'm never empowered to be disrespectful. I don't care how disrespectful they are or how unjust they're being. I'm never empowered to be unjust and disrespectful to them. So how can I handle that kind of a situation in a way that still honors their position over me and preserves me doing what's right for those people who I have charge over? How do I do that? I'm opening up for suggestions.
Be respectful. I mean,
Okay.
do it with respect and say, hey, you know, maybe we should approach this a different way because our employees are offended by this, or you know, something like that.
So be respectful. That's a very excellent observation.
Earlier you mentioned authority and the use of your authority, and as that kind of middle manager, oftentimes you have some sort of authority, and there is probably somebody over the person over you as well, or other structures in those institutions at this point that you could take advantage of if need be. You know,
Right.
Like you go to that person, kind of, you know.
You work up the chain of command.
Right. You go to that person.
Right.
And you see if that can be fixed.
That's exact. By the way, it's very disrespectful to jump the chain of command. It's very disrespectful. You don't go to your boss's boss first. You go to your boss first. And if you don't get resolution, then you work up the chain. Very disrespectful to just jump people. Secondly, here's something else. This used to get talked about a lot. It used to get talked about a lot when I was young. I don't hear people talking about it as much anymore. I don't think we respect relationships quite the way that people once did. But let's put this in a different scenario, a different setting, and maybe we can pick up on this a little quicker. Let's say it's a disagreement you're having with your spouse. Where do you have that discussion? In public, in front of a bunch of people? In private. You wait till you get home and you wait till you're alone. Before your kids, the same thing. Let's say your spouse is disciplining your children and you don't like what they're disciplining them for or why they're disciplining them or how they're, whatever. Do you jump in right there on the spot in front of the kids and undermine their authority in front of the kids, or do you go to them privately and say, hey, we need to talk about this and we need to get on the same page? See, there's a respectful way. You're respecting their honor among those that are their charges. You don't attack them in public, in other words. So you don't just launch out on your boss and say, no, you're wrong. You say, hey, do you got a minute? I need to talk to you. And you say, look, this is what I saw, and this is the problem I have with it, and I feel like it's my duty to defend these people that you're abusing. And you have that conversation privately. And if you can win them and change the scenario, then everybody's better and everybody's respected. But what happens if you do it in public? You undermine their authority. You undermine even their personhood before other people. You actually undermine your own authority. Because what about the guys up the chain from them? They look at me not as someone who is respecting my boss, but as someone who's what? A troublemaker. An insurrectionist. And so there's a way in which you do these things. You have to think about those kind of things and think about how best to handle things. Now, are there times when you have to act and act immediately? Yes. You don't let people get abused physically. You don't let people get hurt. I have no problem in saying that you stop true verbal abuse. But the conversation takes place in private, if at all possible. And the conversation respects the relationship, if at all possible. You don't go in and say, this is how you're going to do your job. You go in and say, hey, as someone who's under your authority and who wants to help you succeed, there's some things I need to talk to you about. This is what I've witnessed, and this is the problem that I have with it. What do you think? And that gives him the opportunity to say, you brought up a good point, and I probably shouldn't behave that way, and I'll handle that differently from now. What they really should do is go out and apologize to people, but that's another story. Whether or not that'll happen, it depends on the personality of the person and how dedicated they are to doing the right thing. But you do it in a way that continues to respect the institution, so that God can be glorified. Again, think about it in these terms. If that's the way you treat them, they're going to want to know why you were so respectful and honorable to them. And they're going to know that you profess to be a Christian. So if you are disrespectful, then that reflects back on God. So we have to be real careful about dealing with those things and honor those relationships to the best of our ability. Try to find the way forward. And we're going to talk about this, like I said, more fully in the next hour. The range is from being completely pacific to being completely dominant and controlling. Doing nothing at all, or meting out vengeance and retribution. That's the range. There's somewhere on that spectrum where we honor God, we honor the relationship, we honor the institution, and we honor the people around us. And the hard part is figuring out what behaviors do that. But the standard that's been given is to do this as unto the Lord. I mean, that one's over and over and over again. Every one of these passages get back to that. Do this as you would for Christ. Do this as unto the Lord rather than men. Do this with God in mind. Mindful of God. Did you notice that in verse 19 that we just read? This is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows. In other words, every relationship that I sustain in life, my behavior within that relationship, I need to be mindful of God in the way I engage it. By the way, that includes when I have the authority and I'm the boss. Do I use that for my benefit? Personal story, when I was in college, I was in a situation where I was a subordinate in a student organization on campus. And one of the things that was required of me was go pick up my dry cleaning. That individual didn't have any business asking me to do that. That was an abuse of really a very weak position. And that's the kind of stuff we can't allow ourselves to do. That's why bosses really shouldn't say, go make me coffee. Go do this. Go run and do this personal errand for me. Go run to my house. We shouldn't use our position to benefit ourselves when their job is to do some task for the company or the organization. It's all about the organization. And so it's not about me personally, it's about the organization. So I don't try to gain benefit from it personally. I try to use that person to help the organization. And one of the ways that I do that is by helping them prosper and do well and have all the training and the things that they need. And so it controls the kind of boss I am too, the way I use the authority that's been given me. I use it to their benefit rather than to my own, if I'm mindful of God. Because how did Christ use his authority? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He used his authority to help us, not to help himself. And so we have to think about that as well.